Hello, fellow humans, Edelbrack Smith here, broadcasting from somewhere on that filthy mudball called Earth. This broadcast is meant as a review of the video game Gylt from the studio Tequila Works, creators of Rhyme, Sexy Brutale, and others. But before we get there, I'd like to talk about one of my favorite games of all time, Alan Wake. Alan Wake is not a perfect game, not by a long shot. The beginning of the story is confusing in a bad way, with the narrative jumping around in ways that never really made sense to me. And the camera can be janky. Really janky. Especially if it gets caught between Alan and a wall, or a car, or a person, or the air. Plus, the ending, while fine, sets up for additional stories that haven't yet materialized. But those are small nitpicks. So what do I love about Alan Wake? Well, it's the feel of the game, the setting. The idea that a human has finally been granted a glimpse beyond themselves into the true, and his mind is so tiny and stupid that all he can do is try and return to normalcy, to blindness. Humans are really such limited creatures. Anyway, Alan Wake is about a writer who catches a glimpse of true reality. His creations, shadow creatures spawned from his stories and his nightmares, chase him throughout a small town nestled in a beautiful mountain valley. His wife has gone missing, dragged to some dark place, and his only goal is to find and rescue her, to ultimately return to their normal lives. Lives that aren't exactly going well when this whole thing begins. You see, Alan is having trouble writing, and it's affecting not only his professional life, but his relationship with his wife Alice as well. Throughout the story, Alan encounters powerful beings, things he refers to as monsters, and Alan himself becomes changed with his knowledge and his exposure to the dark. That brings us back to Gylt. Gylt follows Sally, a larval human searching for her missing cousin Emily. Shadow creatures, spawned from the unknown, chase her throughout a small town nestled in a beautiful mountain valley. Her cousin has gone missing, dragged to some dark place, and her only goal is to find and rescue her, ultimately returning to their normal lives. Lives that aren't exactly going well when this whole thing begins. Throughout the story, Sally encounters powerful beings, things she refers to as monsters, and she becomes changed by the knowledge she gains. If that sounds familiar, it's because the game might as well be called Sally Wake. Probably with a better title, but you get what I mean. Not convinced yet? Let me show you. Both protagonists use a flashlight as their main form of defense from the shadow monsters. Pulling the left trigger causes the beam to focus, and pulling the right causes active damage. In Alan Wake, that's firing a gun, while in Gylt, it's making the flashlight stronger, somehow? Using the flashlight in combat drains its battery in both games, requiring you to find more or be rendered less capable of defense. Collectible pages also play a major role in these games. In Alan Wake, these are mostly pages from his book, which turns out to be the exact events he's going through in the game, and they provide a greater context for the action. In Gylt, these are primarily diary entries written by various characters throughout the game, and reading these entries provides a greater context for what's happening in that game. In fact, both game stories suffer dramatically if you ignore these story-based collectibles. Not just the endings either, as a good portion of the story, a lot of the clarifying moments, happen inside these pages. There are more parallels to be drawn, but I don't want to get into spoiler territory. Suffice it to say that the two games are similar. The biggest difference? Target audience. Alan Wake was targeting a more mature audience, with stories about a failing marriage and friendships of a middle-aged man who is thrust into a dark world where everything is a mirror of his own psyche. It's an often unsettling game full of a few jump scares and a lot of existential dread, kind of like a Stephen King novel. As a lover of reading and a content creator myself, the idea of being haunted by my own creations resonates powerfully with me. Gylt is targeting a younger audience. It feels like a mix between Alan Wake, Stranger Things, and the movie version of Coraline. The graphics are serviceable, sometimes even really nice. You're not going to confuse them with current generation AAA, but they get the job done, and most importantly, they don't detract from the atmosphere, which is the real star of Gylt. The music at times can feel very Danny Elfman, very Edward Scissorhands. It's creepy and atmospheric, and sometimes it slips right into anxiety-inducing, with its almost heart-like beating in quiet moments. There were even a few moments that I legitimately squealed. Often just stopping and catching my breath as my racing heart slowed back down. Most of the time, it's not actively trying to scare you, just provide a constant sense of dread, and it does a pretty good job. There was one part of Gylt where the atmosphere didn't hold up quite as well though, the comic book style cutscenes. They can work well when done right, but here they kind of really detracted from the atmosphere. I would have preferred a darker vibe or in-game cinematics, but they do the job of conveying the story for the most part. You'll get the large brushstrokes of Sally and her attempts to find and rescue Emily throughout the cutscenes in the gameplay, but you won't find out much about the world, about the darkness, or about what's happening unless you take the time to collect and read the various diary entries found throughout the game, as I mentioned earlier. Some of them were real gut punches too, and they had me truly feeling for these people. Stories not just of supernatural dread, but of deep sadness and loss. Stories of people being bullied to the point where they're eating their lunch in the bathroom or seeing their long-lost loved ones and being filled with hope, a hope you know was unfounded based on how you found the diary. The writing in these can grab you and pull you deeper into the darkness of Gylt, not only as standalone bites, but as flavoring for the rest of the story. They provide context and understanding, as much as can be expected, into what's happening in this small mining town, and I'm really worried that some people aren't going to take the time to read these. Speaking of collectibles, I recommend gathering all of them, as the ending without them is a bit lackluster. To be fair, I found the ending, even with 100% completion, to be a bit of a letdown. It felt rushed at the end, and though the final area had some of the coolest set pieces in the game, which I won't spoil here, the final story beats were too incomplete. They wrapped up the story quickly and with too much finality. With a game like this, with cosmic horror in general, the ending is usually best if it's a bit ambiguous, a bit foreboding. In general, I don't like tying the good endings in games to 100% completion, as I feel like it does a disservice to casual players, but none of the endings presented in Gylt really felt all that great anyway. It's kind of the worst part of the game for sure, but it's definitely not a reason to skip this one. All the negatives do add up to make the experience less than it could have been, but I wasn't comparing it to Alan Wake because I thought it was a bad game. Alan Wake is one of my all-time favorites, and Gylt provides a similar experience. It's a gateway into cosmic horror that is perfect for nearly everyone. Younger kids who play may be exposed to cosmic horror for the first time, while experiencing a story of bullying and loneliness that they can likely empathize with. Older gamers can find a sometimes cute, often oppressive, and occasionally terrifying piece of fiction that can be surprisingly dark. Cosmic horror fans or fans of Remedy's games should pick it up right now. It doesn't have the graphical fidelity of Remedy's best work, but it's a fantastic companion piece, and it stands on its own as one of the best experiences I've had on Stadia so far. As to how well it functioned, it was pretty flawless. Now I'm running a high-end gaming PC with a wired Xbox One controller, a wired Ethernet connection with about 400 megabits up and 700 down, and if it didn't run well, I would have been pretty upset. I also spent some time playing Gylt on my 1080p television through the Chromecast Ultra, where it worked just fine through a hardwired connection to my router. Playing on my Pixel 4 over Wi-Fi was a bit of a different story, however. It mostly ran well when I was in the same room as my router, but going into any of the other rooms in my house produced a slightly worse experience. For the most part, the game was playable throughout the whole house, but there were the occasional stutter or lag in some of the other rooms. Another note is that I was playing Gylt during the COVID lockdown, just after they opened the base edition to everyone, so that could have had some performance impact. The game still ran beautifully, and I have very few complaints overall, even after setting the data usage back up to best visual quality. But with Stadia, you must keep in mind that my experience with performance may not resemble yours, which is why I've saved it for a small section at the end of the review. Oops, looks like the stars are moving out of alignment, or the internet's behind a cloud? Yeah, that sounds right. Either way, it means my broadcast must come to an end. A final word. If you haven't given Gylt a try, it's a hearty recommendation from me. It isn't perfect, and it's not as mature as I would have liked, but it's a fantastic gateway into cosmic horror that everyone should experience. Edelbrack Smith, signing out.